I will now just warn our participants that this is being recorded for our own records and archives, which is also why only the two of us will be visible during this conversation. John, in 1938, you were living in Czechoslovakia. How old were you at the time?
I was 6 years old. I was born in 1932, and we were living, as you show on the map, in Ústí nad Labem. That's in Czech. In German, it was Aussicht am Elbe. And my father, who was the director of a bank, the Czech Industrial Bank, Česká průmyslová banka, had been transferred there recently from another town where we were living in southern Moravia, which was another province of Czechoslovakia. And earlier, he was in another Czechoslovak town in Chomutov, where I was born in 1932, and my brother, Frederick, in English, or Bedřich in Czech, was born there 2 years earlier. We all were perfectly happy in Czechoslovakia.
John, I'm going to interrupt you. There is a bit of an echo. Could you make sure that all the speakers in your room that are putting out the sound are turned down?
Okay. Yes. All the speakers turned down.
Yours. Okay.
Yeah,
Yes, I think by now they are turned down.
it's working now. I'm going to
Good.
share a photograph of your family so you can tell us a little bit about them, if that's all right. Can you see?
Yes, here is my father. In fact, that photo was taken the day he married my mother, my father Ludwig, in Czech, Louis Tetzeli, and they married in the chapel of Castle Nemyshel in 1929. It was a very intimate marriage, not many people there. Here they are with my cousin, their nephew, Lynn Cass, the son of one of the sisters of mother. The reason it was a small wedding was that her father, Count Frederick Dane, had passed away
John,
earlier that year.
John, terribly sorry to interrupt again, but there is still an echo. I think.
Yes, now it's okay. Now it's okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
So the wedding was an intimate affair because her father had died.
Had passed away in January of that year. Just a few friends and family members attended. Father, as I mentioned, was a banker, and he was a director of the Czech Industrial Bank. And during those years, we lived in several towns in the Czech Republic until in 1938, he was transferred to Aussicht. And there, some political events came to pass, which were decisive and very influential in the decision to leave the country. Aussicht, Ústí was a hotbed of German agitation. The Germans that lived in Czechoslovakia had been encouraged by Hitler in Germany to join the German Reich. And that's where my parents decided to leave the country. But before, let me tell you something about my experience as a kid in Czechoslovakia. My earliest memories date back to 1935 and 36, when we were in Znojmo, a town in southern Moravia, Czechoslovakia. We lived in an apartment house that had a big backyard we shared, where we played my brother, Frederick, also known as Bossy, and I, also known as Yanni, with other children. We had a governess, Miss Skipalova, always watching over us. We spoke Czech and German. Mother would read us books in both languages. We would travel by car to visit our grandparents in Plzeň and Nemišl. The latter, Nemišl, was where mother had been born. We really specially enjoyed. It was the grand homestead of the Dame family, DYM, that was her maiden name, a castle in the countryside surrounded by rolling fields, forests, and lakes. There we would meet with our cousins, Ivan, Ariane, and Jana Dame, the children of Joseph Dame, the owner of the castle, and Lynn and Mary Cast. Lynn is the kid you see in the pictures you showed of the wedding of mother, where she is with the groom, my father, and Lynn, who was about 3 or 4 years old. We would play with them, swim in the lake, pick blueberries in the forest and other berries in the garden. On Sundays, we would go to Mass in a church at a nearby village in a horse-drawn carriage driven by Sekan, the coachman. We would also visit the forester in the house by the woods. Christmas in Nemišl was especially joyful and evocative. Around the castle lighted Christmas tree, we would gather with our cousins and children from the village to sing Czech country Christmas carols. I still remember the melodies and words after 82 years. There would be a Bethlehem-like village, all built in gingerbread, and gifts would appear for all. Then the family would gather for a big supper, starting with a carp soup, the one fare I thoroughly disliked. Later, all attended midnight mass in the village church. Omami, my maternal grandmother, was the loving mistress of Nemišl, our always caring guide. In spring, in our place in Znojmo, we received the visit of my maternal great-grandmother, who lived in Třiž, Moravia, the Sternbach property where Omami, my grandmother, had been born. I was told to take Urgroßmama, that's how we call her in German, for a walk to a nearby park. I gave her my hand and walked very slowly, being extra careful to observe the traffic lights when we crossed the streets. We sat on a bench in the park. I observed the sparrow jumping time and time again, and I asked her, "Why is this sparrow doing gymnastics?" Back home, she relayed it with a smile to mother. "I guess I must have seen many photos of the gymnastic events of Sokol, the French gymnastic civil organization then in its heyday. In the summer of 1937, Freddie and I were present at the last grand event in Castle Nemischl. It was the marriage of Edie Dame, Mother's youngest sister. There were 5 sisters and 1 brother. She was marrying Ernest van Panhuys, a Dutch diplomat. Freddie, cousin Ivan, and I were dressed in short-sleeved clear blue suits, with cousin Lynn, then 11 years old, was dressed as a grown-up in an Eton suit with coat and tie and a small ceremonial sword. Much to our envy, the marriage was performed in the nearby country Baroque chapel of the convent of Clocothy in the nearby small town of Tabor. We were driven along with our cousins in a big convertible with the top down. Later, in the park of the castle, we performed for the guests a skit in Czech country costume. At the wedding banquet, cousin Carver Barata symbolically threw a crystal glass that broke on the floor for luck to the bride and groom. Let me show you a photo. That's us at the wedding.
It's not
The
very
cousins.
visible. If you can get it closer to the screen, further up and closer to the
Yeah.
screen. Further up. Yeah. Now further to the right. That's
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, okay. That's us at the wedding with our cousins. And let me see if I find one. Yes, and that's
Okay. To the right. To the right.
right.
Further up. Further up. Yes. More up. Up, up, up. Yes. You can see it a little bit now.
That's all the people at the wedding. And here are some pictures of Castle Nemischl. This is the elm tree.
To the right.
Guillaume.
Further up. Further up. Now pull it back a little bit.
Pull it back.
Yeah. And further to the right. Yes. And further up.
Okay.
Yes.
This is the round tower, which was the oldest part of the castle that dated to the 14th century.
Was
And,
the castle always in your family?
well, they bought it actually fairly recently in 1790. And prior to that, they had other different castles. They sort of flipped castles during many centuries. You must realize Bohemia, Czechoslovakia, is a very old country. And when Mother decided to write her memoirs, she found that the origin of her name, Dame, and of her coat of arms, which had the keys, dated back to the number 10th century.
Was that why your mother was so connected with the birth of Czechoslovakia, with the Czechoslovakian?
Very much so. Very much so. She came of age when the Czechoslovakia was created. It used to be a kingdom, the Kingdom of Bohemia, which since 1620, when the Protestant Czechs lost the battle to the Austrian Catholic Habsburg, the Battle of the White Mountain, it became part of Austro-Hungary. And it was the industrial hub of that empire. a very prosperous part of the empire with very hard-working people, not hotheads, people that just enjoyed working, creating, were very artistic, and the Danes were very progressive. In 1830, they gave freedom to their serfs much earlier than most of the other countries that had this feudal structure, where freedom was given after the revolutions of 1848. And they were, that was a Frederick Dane, an ancestor of my grandfather, who was also Frederick Dane. And he was also a politician. And he advocated for greater autonomy to his country, Bohemia, just as my grandfather did. But my maternal grandfather, Count Frederick Dane, was a monarchist. He was very loyal to the empire. Mother, his first daughter, did not agree. And she had friendly discussions with him. And she saw the birth of the Czechoslovak Republic as a solution to the problems that the kingdom had in the past, because it was sort of put in the back by Austria. And grandfather accepted it. And in fact, there's something that I found out much later when I access Wikipedia. And there's a long story about my grandfather. And it says at the end, in the autumn of 1918, Frederick Dane gave his Prague palace in Jindřiška Street for the needs of Czechoslovak National Committee. And here was the establishment of the first Czechoslovak government. The palace later was bought by the National Bank of Czechoslovakia. So, you know, at the end, he collaborated.
Your mother convinced your
Maybe
grandfather.
swayed by mother's arguments, yes.
And was your
But-
father also connected to Czech patriotism?
My father was born actually in Austria, where his father, who was an Austro-Hungarian military, was in charge of a garrison in Wels, Austria. But the Tetzelis' hometown was Pilsen or Pilsen, the brewery town. And father really followed a whole lot mother in her patriotic Czech nationalism thoughts, and was highly influenced by her, as later on I would be too.
So in
But
1948, you had just moved to former Aussig, to Ústí.
Auschwitz, yes.
And when and why did your parents decide to leave Czechoslovakia?
Well, for several years since the advent of the Hitler dictatorship in Germany and the takeover of neighboring Austria by Germany, my parents was very politically savvy, thought that it could pose a threat to the freedoms they enjoyed in Czechoslovakia, which was just the opposite of Germany in that it was tolerant, it was not anti-Semitic, Jews and other nationalities were welcome in Czechoslovakia, they didn't even sort of realize they were Jews. I mean, they were so welcome. And you have the story of Madeleine Albright, who became Secretary of State here. Her name in Czech was Korbel. Her father was a Czech diplomat. He was stationed sometime in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. And when she came to this country, that's when she realized she was Jewish. In the Czech Republic, it was not an issue. And of course, Hitler made it the main issue to fanatize his people and, frankly, to rob the Jews. And
while you were living in Aussig, do you have any memories in Usti? Do you have
Well,
any memories of what the street was like?
oh yes, we would live in a third floor, but we would need hear the shouting, the people screaming in the streets, which was something totally extraordinary in a democracy like Czechoslovakia. Our schools were bilingual. There was no discrimination for the Germans. They were doing very well. But Hitler, for his own geopolitical purpose, really managed to fanatize them. And it was, of course, totally surprising for us, but for my parents, it was like the confirmation of their fears. And the only member of the Dame or Tetzeli family that left Czechoslovakia in that year was my father, Ludwig, and my mother, and me and Freddie. So we went to Belgium, and here are the photos of my aunt, Blanca Kronecker, and my godfather, Paul Kronecker. My middle name is Paul because our parents adopted in honor of Paul. Paul was a very influential person in Belgium. He was an entrepreneur, and among other enterprises, he owned a sugar refinery. So when we arrived in Belgium, he told father he could work in the sugar refinery, and he became a director of the corporation owned by Paul, the Société pour l'exportation des sucres. That was French. In English, it would be the Corporation for the Export of Sugars. And the sugar refinery he owned in the town of Tirlemont, not far from Antwerp, where we settled in Belgium, used Cuban raw sugar. So there, through the business of sugar, father got to know many Cubans that became, that were the suppliers of raw sugar for the refinery. So the next chapter in Belgium starts on May 10, 1940, when we were living in a suburb of Antwerp, which is the main port of Belgium. And I was the first one to wake up that morning because I heard some very loud booms, terrible noise, and I knocked on my parents' door, and father opened, and I told him, I think there is a big storm. And father, who knew better, told me, yes, there's a big storm. we were in a way prepared for the worst, because in 1914, the Germans had already invaded Belgium in the First World War. And in fact, my godfather, Paul Kronacker, had fought in the Belgian army already. He was born in 1997, so he was in military age, and he fought in that war. And he had told us time and time again, prepare yourself, it will happen again, as it did. So we packed our car. We had a nice 1938 Chevrolet convertible, and went to Tirlemont, where Blanca lived. And Paul happened to be on a mission in Paris, but had told Blanca he would return immediately. So we went with Blanca to a town on the border between Belgium and France, Poptrank. And we thought, well, we would sort of weather the storm here. We saw French and British troops passing through, and the population cheering. At night, the Germans would bomb, the sirens would blare, and we would go to the basement of the hotel where we are staying. And a couple of days later, Paul appeared in his Belgian Army Reserve uniform and his gorgeous Talbot coupe, painted camouflage. And Freddie and I were duly impressed. But 2 days later, we realized we had to leave. The campaign in Belgium lasted 18 days. They fought valiantly, but they were no match for the blitzkrieg that Hitler had carefully prepared. So Paul had given Father maps of France, where he marked the secondary roads that, in case of a German breakthrough, should be used to go to the south of France. And Father followed it, and we were lucky enough to, avoid the strafing and the disasters that happened in the Exodus, and arrive in Bordeaux at the end of May, or rather early July, yes, early June 1940. Bordeaux was chock full of refugees. And there, yes, is a photo of Bordeaux, all the traffic. So we couldn't find anything within the city of Bordeaux. It was overrun not only by refugees, but by employees of the Czech government and politicians. It was panicky. So we went outside of Bordeaux, and we found a lovely peasant house, which was for rent. 2 stories, whitewash with blue shutters, where I saw first the bamboo trees. The roses were in bloom. We called it the Chateau Bleu. So we stayed about 2 weeks in the Chateau Bleu until Father met the man whose photo you see here, Aristides de Sousa Mendes, the consul of Portugal in Bordeaux. It turned out that he was a real hero, a great humanitarian. We didn't know that. We discovered that much later. But the fact remains that he immediately gave us visas to be able to go to Portugal and leave France. That was our object in June 1940, to leave France because we knew that France would surrender,
If I,
and we
um,
could not afford to stay there.
if I can just interject here, I would just like to give our the participants some idea about who Aristides de Sousa Mendes was. He was the Portuguese consul in Bordeaux, and the Portuguese government had decided that consuls were not to give entry visas, not even transit visas to
Right,
Portugal,
right,
without prior authorization of the Portuguese government.
yes. And he, for humanitarian reasons, totally disregarded the orders of his government. And when he returned to Bordeaux, he felt in disgrace. He knew that,
Yes, yes.
but
did-
he sacrificed
he
for the sake
sacrificed his
of others.
career,
Yeah.
and he's the well-being of
Tremendous hero.
the family.
Yeah.
What we're seeing here on the right is the visa registry of the consulate, and you can find here Maria Antonia, which I believe is your aunt, and Ludovic Tetzeli. And what is interesting often to
Yes.
us as we research this is that you have 2 visas for 5 people. And this is why it's often so difficult to ascertain how many people Aristides actually rescued, because even when we have the records, we realize that not all of the people are written down.
Right, are listed.
It's
Now,
out about families such as yourselves that we realize that there are many more people hidden behind one
right,
visa.
right, yeah, yeah. Of course, our aunt Blanca, who was driven by Paul's chauffeur to Bordeaux. In Bordeaux, she drove herself to the border. Now, I'm certain that she was given a visa also because eventually she went with us all the way to Estoril, to Portugal. But were it not for that fact, we would have not been able to leave Portugal. I mean, France. We would have been caught by the Nazis, and with them, if you were not with them, you were against them. And definitely, our parents were totally anti-Nazi. It went against their values, and they would have been sent to a concentration camp. So we were awfully lucky. And also, we must recognize that there was a Spanish diplomat, Eduardo Propo de Callejon, who worked with Aristides de Sousa Mendes, and he was instrumental in facilitating the transit visa through Spain, because we were driving our cars, so we had to go through Spain. No, we were extremely lucky, and unfortunately, we never were able to give proper thanks to Aristides Sousa Mendes, because we didn't know what he had done. It happened that some years ago, my cousin, Bill Tetzeli, my nephew, excuse me, Bill Tetzeli, called me and asked me, Johnny, do you know about the Portuguese consul in Lisbon? No, no. What is it? Oh, he's a real hero. And he gave your father, my grandfather, he said, the visas to leave France on time. And he saved your life. So, okay, tell me how. And he gave me the phone number of the foundation that was started in his honor in Europe. So I spoke with Olivia Paris, the chairman, and she told me, let me send you some information. And
She's listening to
so,
us tonight, so we will just say hello to her and salute the fantastic work that is done by the Sousa Mendes Foundation in
yes,
locating families and survivors and
yes.
putting them in
No,
touch with their own history and
their job was terrific because we tend to forget history or not to know it, as happened with me. So uh, organizations that foster the knowledge of history and that we learned from the past in order not to repeat the same errors. Yes, yes. So
a question.
we,
Um, what are your memories of going through Spain? Spain was in the middle of a civil war, had just come out of the civil war.
oh yes, no, Spain was a sad country, and they had lost about 1 million of their people, you know, in a very cruel civil war. Well, all civil wars are, and a year or so it had finished, but there was a whole lot of destruction, poverty. The bread was dark if you could obtain it. No, it was, in fact, terrible. We were glad to be able to go through Spain, uh, but the environment uh, was clearly of a country that had suffered terribly, terribly. And you could see it by the ruins everywhere, and the people that were so dark, poor. So we went through Spain. We went to Madrid, where my aunt Edith, to whose marriage I had been in 1937, was with her husband Ernest van Anhuys, who was a diplomat with the Dutch embassy in Madrid. And then we followed and went through the old city of Merida, where our parents took the time to show us the beautiful Roman ruins. And then we entered Portugal, another world, a country in peace. You know, people were happy. When we had a meal there, we discovered that bread indeed was white and wonderful, and the food and everything. Uh, for us, that was really a change of scene. Finally, finally, we were no longer in a hurry, and we were in a country that was enjoying peace. Uh,
Did you feel safe?
Please.
Did you feel safe when you arrived in Portugal? Did you feel safe?
Oh yes, we felt totally different. Yeah, yeah. It was a relief. You know, we we are no longer running from the enemy, and we are in a country that has welcomed us, which was exceptional in 1940. You know, so many people were in panic, running, not knowing where what would happen the next day. Yes, it was a great relief. And then Blanca had chosen Estoril, which was wonderful because it was a beautiful uh, small town, and there is the Pensão panorama where we stayed. We stayed there for a couple of weeks, but I always remember how wonderfully welcoming the people were. We could speak French with some of them. We would go every day to a beach nearby, Freddie and I,
No, Estoril, Pensão Panorama was located extremely close to the main beach of Estoril, right by the train station.
yes,
Tamariz. And to this day, it is a very, very popular beach among the tourists.
oh, beautiful place, sort of very high end with a casino and what. uh, our parents were busy finding a way to go to the Western Hemisphere, to go to the Americas. Of course, the US was practically out of the question because they had very strict immigration policies and there was such an exodus. And on the other hand, father had friends in Cuba. So he decided to apply for a Cuban visa and he got it. So with the Cuban visa, we had to find a way to cross the Atlantic. And if father discovered if we traveled further north to the port of Vigo, which is right by the Portuguese border in Portugal, we would find a Spanish steamship.
Before we
to go.
I would just like to stop a little bit and talk about your time here in Estoril. So
Oh yes.
The photograph you see here is Pensão Panorama. This photograph is in the collection of our historical archives.
Uh-huh.
And it was given to us by a collector and there's this catalog that is extremely useful in locating these establishments that for the most part have now disappeared. What we also have at our historical archives are the lodging bulletins. And I'm going to take time here so that our participants also understand how we found you.
Exactly, the register of the Pensão Panorama. Yes, there is Ludwig Tetzeli, because he signed with the name that appeared in his passport, which was a Czech name, Ludwig, which is Louis, and his last name, Tetzeli. Czechoslovakia, that's Czechoslovakia in French, and Wels was the city where he was born. And then profession, director of the Société pour l'exportation du sucre, director of the Corporation for Exportation of Sugars. Yeah. And here is a mother, Tetzeli, Dane, her maiden name, yes, Czechoslovakia, born in 97, father was born in 01. That's the register, yeah. No, it's a miracle you found.
I wanted to talk a little bit about this to explain these documents. These are lodging bulletins that were required by law to be filled out by every non-Portuguese guest that was staying at a hotel during the period. And these would be sent by the hotels to the political police. And now this
I see.
Police that had refused all these visas to Sousa Mendes. So they were keeping track in the country. We were very lucky that these documents survived. As far as
yes.
We are the only municipality in Portugal that has these documents. And
yes, so, because it's proof that the consul did not follow the instructions of his own government.
Definitely.
Much to his credit.
Definitely not. What happened was that we knew these documents existed, but we have somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000 of these. So choosing where to begin can be extremely overwhelming. So what we did is that we looked at the Sousa Mendes Foundation database and started cross-referencing with our names. And so not only did we find your bulletin and the bulletin of those that the Sousa Mendes Foundation knew were already in Estoril, we also discovered that many of those that were listed as staying in other cities had also stayed in Estoril. So we've been able to locate circa 200 people with Sousa Mendes visas that stayed in Cascais and Estoril. And that is, it's important to find out this information.
Yes.
Not only because of the families, to tell the families and show other families these documents like we showed you, but also to be able to analyze in more detail the deeds of Sousa Mendes. There's always a lot of debate. How many people did he rescue? And the estimates vary between 8,000 to the tens of thousands.
Yeah.
And I think that the Cascais and Estoril case study can really help people understand better the actions of Sousa Mendes.
Yes.
We also have the lodging bulletin, of course, for your aunt, but we didn't include it here.
Yeah. Right.
And the interesting thing for us as well when we look at these are the dates of entry and the dates of leaving. In your case, you stayed for 3 weeks at Pensão Panorama. We've had we've seen refugee families who stayed for 9 months in Estoril and Cascais, and so the duration of stay really varies according to the ability of the family
Exactly.
find
To,
out.
to find a way to the Americas, and that's the steamship, the Marquês de Comilla, that we boarded. Freddie, myself, mother and father, and Aunt Blanca, that took us to Havana, where we landed in July of 1940. Yeah.
So once you
Yes.
arrived in Cuba, did your father where did your father go to work?
Well, of course, it was 1940, and he was a director of this corporation headquartered in Belgium, and we were received by his suppliers, among them Julio Lobo, who eventually became the Cuban sugar czar. He was at the dock waiting for us, but father very fast had to find other ways to make a living. It so happened that an American diplomat, Ken Potter, had been in Prague previously. And when Prague was occupied by the Germans, of course, he couldn't stay. It was no longer a free country. It was a protectorate. So the State Department assigned him to Havana. And they met, and I remember Ken Potter. He had a daughter, Debbie, our age, and we became friends. And Ken Potter suggested to father to establish contacts with American firms interested in exporting their goods to Cuba. And that's what he did at the outset. Of course, a year and a half later, in December of 41, the Second World War became a real World War when Japan attacked the US, and the US declared war on Germany. So there he changed, and one of the things father never forgot was loyalty to Czechoslovakia. And right away, he began through friends that were in the broadcasting business or in the newspaper business to let the Cuban people know the horrors of the German occupation of Czechoslovakia. And he went to Washington, D.C., where the Czech ambassador had not surrendered the embassy to the Germans, but stayed there. And the US continued recognizing him. And eventually, his activities were noticed by the Czech government in exile in London. the Czech President Beneš had gone in exile to London, and they named him press attaché and created a legation in Havana and sent a Czech career diplomat in charge, like chargé d'affaires, and father was his press attaché. And I remember on October 28, 1942, October 28 is the anniversary of the creation of Czechoslovakia. In 1918, father organized a big event in one of the main theaters in Havana. And we were there, my brother Freddie and I, and we heard him speak about the Nazi horrors. And then several foreign diplomats and Cuban journalists gave their testimony. And in 2002, there was an event in Miami where that testimony was repeated at the university, and I attended. And the speech that one of father's Cuban friends gave was repeated. So I learned much later about the activities that, by sheer patriotism, father engaged in Cuba to make known the threat of Nazi Germany. And I'm eternally grateful to him for that.
John, we have a question here from Carlos Guerreiro. He is the author of a blog called Land in Portugal, and he studies the planes and traffic, sea traffic during the war. And he's really curious about what you did during the day. So you were saying that you went to the beach. Did you go with your father
Yes.
to get the visas, or did your father go alone?
No, father and mother usually went, but mother would take us to the beach, and many times she had a friend in the beach. There was a Dutch lady which we knew in Belgium, Annie van Vredenburg, who was there also, and many times she took care of us. But usually mother would accompany us and stay with us if there wasn't anybody known to her. Remember that the Dame girls, Mother and Blanca, and Edi and Filipka and Gabi, had a wide network all over Europe of friends and acquaintances here. But we greatly enjoyed our life in Estoril, and I think we went to a park also nearby. But mother took extremely good care of us always. Years later, when we very occasionally would speak about leaving Czechoslovakia, going through France, and mother confessed to us, I was terribly afraid in France. And I made a promise to God. If we were able to emerge alive from this, I would no longer smoke. And she ceased smoking.
That's a promise.
But she confessed it to us many, many years later. No, I mean,
Do you remember things like the food, for example? Do you remember what you ate when you were here? What would your family eat? What did you? Sometimes that's a memory that refugees.
yes. Well, when we were leaving Belgium, we took along a big ham, jambon d'Ardenne, in the Ardennes region of France, which we had visited in the winter of 1939, 1940. They produce excellent hams. And we had one of them with us. But you know, you get a bit tired of especially, I mean, one of those which is a bit salted. It's good. Uh, but no, we somehow, you know, managed to survive. When we crossed the border of Spain, we went to I think San Sebastian at a nice hotel, and then straight to Madrid, where our aunt Edie lived. And then I think we stopped in Merida overnight in a hotel. But the impression looking outside was terrible in Spain. Very, very sad, very depressing. Yeah.
And at Pensão Panorama, do you remember what you ate at the Pensão?
Oh, I know we ate plenty of fish, which we loved, you know, plenty, yeah. And well, the local food was very, very good. No, uh, our parents really, really appreciated the welcome that we were given in Portugal. You know.
We have another question from another participant. She's asking if you remember how you interacted with the local people. Did you play with Portuguese kids, or did you play with Portuguese families at the beach or at the park? Do you remember?
Uh, I know that in the beach there were some Portuguese kids, and we did play with them, you know, building whatever castles in the beach with sand, or and the lack of the local language was no obstacle. And I know that in the hotel there were some employees, I think, that spoke French. We we use our French. Uh, when we were expelled from the countries we lived by the Germans twice, we decided to drop German. Czechoslovakia was, you know, bilingual, Czech and German, but we said no more German in this household, French. So even in Cuba, at home, we would speak French. And mother later would give French lessons in Cuba.
At the Pensão Panorama, you were able to speak French with the people who work there.
Yes, yes.
Okay. We have
Yes.
another question. This is from Caroline Henriques Pereira, who is a researcher on the refugee community in Caldas da Rainha, which was another place in Portugal. And she asks if you ever came back to Cascais, or if you ever attempted to come back to Estoril to visit.
Oh yes, we were back. We started visiting Portugal in 1989, and we took, I think it was a little train to Estoril, but we went all over Sintra, Nazaré, Óbidos. Oh no, it was gorgeous because we drove from Seville. I mean, we rented a car in Seville and we drove uh, all the way. No, and we re, uh, Toman, yes. We repeated that experience several times. We loved the Gulbenkian Museum.
Very good museum. It was actually the legacy of another refugee who was here.
Yes, right,
Yes,
right.
Gulbenkian.
And
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 he also stayed in Estoril during the war.
yes, my wife, her father had friends, Cuban friends, and one of the friends of the Borrell family had been a wife of Gulbenkian. She was married to Gulbenkian.
Yes,
Yes.
Navarte. She actually
Uh,
stayed more often in Cascais than
and excuse me.
Nevarte Gulbenkian stayed more often at Hotel Palacio in Estoril than her husband, who would stay in Lisbon.
Yes.
She liked Estoril better.
Oh, yeah, than he. but that's a wonderful museum.
We went back
Uh,
4 years ago.
I mean, and it's just the right size, you know. You don't get lost.
40-minute visit. It's the perfect.
Yeah, and we went back 4 years ago. 4 years ago, and that's one of the places we always visit in Lisbon. Yeah, no, this one is lovely. We enjoyed it tremendously. The people are, you know, so nice. We went to see a fado, you know, but we had to go up and down and up. Finally, we found it, and beautiful music. You know.
Yeah, but in
So
1990,
Olivia Mattis is asking
Yeah.
if you wouldn't mind sharing with us the frightening incident in France.
Oh yes, well, okay. Fast forward, my brother passed away too early at age 75 in 2005. In Princeton, they had the funerals, and my nephews were there, and they asked me, "Well, would you say a few words about your brother?" And he was the senior. He was a very handsome lad, very talented. He rose to become managing director of J.P. Morgan, which is the main corporate bank in the U.S. Now it's J.P. Morgan Chase, and he was in charge of institutional business in Europe. And when I returned from my trip in 1989 to Lisbon, I said, "Oh, yes, I arrived to Lisbon and I crossed a beautiful bridge." And he said, "Well, you know, my bank participated in financing that bridge." And well, I told the people gathered at his funeral about our exodus from France, because this was a determining event in our life. And when it ended, uh, one of the friends, local Princeton friends, uh, a lady asked me, "Did your brother tell you about the incident that your father had at the crossroads in France?" I said, "No." And she told me, "Well, at the crossroads, he felt duty bound to leave the car, grab a gun, and shoot a nice Nazi German fifth columnist who was creating havoc at that crossroads." I had never been told, but I believe it certainly could have happened. I remember that there was something, I didn't know what, where uh, we were in a very noisy area in a French road, and we had stopped, and father was away, and then he returned, and everything was quiet. And knowing my family, uh, that, you know, father could have considered his elder son privy to some information, and mother, who would have known it, would have never disclosed it, neither to me nor to my brother. But father, yes, mother was a pacifist, you know. But I think father would have been quite capable. Yes, yes.
We have another question.
There are, you know, there are secrets in our families. Yes.
This, I think it's in extraordinary circumstances, people do things that are out of the ordinary.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
Same thing as being in
That's
the
true.
car, going for a drive to Sintra.
Yeah, yeah,
Serious
yeah.
situation. There's
And you
a
know,
question here from Filipa Plesman. She's actually the wife of the great nephew of a pilot who also stayed here in Cascais during the war, and who was shot down over Normandy, and
oh,
he did not survive. And she asks, "What about school? How was your education affected?"
well, in Belgium, we went to a parochial school and we learned both Flemish and French. We loved the school, and Freddie and I, the family was Catholic, had first communion there in Koningshof. And I have, in fact, a photo of the priest who gave me first communion, Father Van Hissenhoven, a lovely people. And then from that's him and I, Father Van Hissenhoven, who gave me first communion in Koningshof, Belgium. And that's me finally I got my Eton suit. I don't know why it was the custom in Belgium, to dress in Eton when you got your first communion. That was it.
It's the transition is very important. It's a very
And then our grade and high school education was happened in Cuba in a Jesuit school. Colegio de Belén was a huge, modern, beautiful Jesuit school in the outskirts of Havana. And in fact, the friend of father, Julio Lobo, told him, you should enroll these kids in Colegio de Belén. The most, let's say, infamous graduate is Fidel Castro. Thanks God I didn't know him. But that's going too much forward. Cuba, when we arrived in 1940, was peaceful. A new constitution drafted by an assembly elected by the people had been put in place. There were free elections, and the strong army man, Fulgencio Batista, came to power. We graduated from Belén in 1950, myself, my brother in 1948. He was very taken by the United States. We had traveled in 1944 for the first time to the US, where Blanca, who was living in New York, invited us. She, in turn, had friends in Lake George, up in New York State. But we could not stay there because one of the kids had mumps. So she, with her network, she said, don't worry. She called a friend in Alabama, the McGowans. That was another American connection with the Dane family. And one of the McGowans, Eleanor McGowan, who is our age, says our families were intertwined. I would go too far if I said it started in 1926 in Florence, but okay, let's go to Alabama. And we spent many of our summer vacations since 1944 and then as teenagers in Chapman, Alabama. The McGowans, a lovely family, graduates, many of them from Oxford in England. They donated the funds for a library in Oxford. Among the brothers and sisters, they had a chamber music orchestra, not country and western, no, chamber music orchestra in Alabama. And we loved them, and their place in Chapman, Alabama, in the countryside, surrounded by lakes and forests, reminded us of Nemisho. And we were always friends with them, and I hope that one of them, Eleanor, is participating uh, in this Zoom.
We have
But
I just wanted to bring to you a couple of testimonies. We have here two teachers, two high school teachers. They work in the Carregal do Sal, and that is the municipality where the birthplace of Aristides and his
oh yes, well,
is located. So we just wanted to say hello to them. They are quite happy to be hearing your testimony. They have very interesting projects in the high school on Sousa Mendes's choices, ethical choices, and his deeds. We do have a question here, sorry, at the bottom. It's by Sonia. Sonia was a volunteer with us. She's a poet.
well,
She's a volunteer with us last year. She's now back in the US. And she says, Mr. Tetzeli mentioned remembering songs from his childhood. I was wondering if he was willing to share any titles, maybe share a few verses, and whether these songs are still sung today.
well, the songs I remember from my childhood are Czech songs and carols,
Christmas carols?
carols, Christmas carols. Já ti nesu veselého, beránka svátka svého, já trošku nalička, mi velitelička. I'm bringing you a happy sheep for your birthday, and milk so that your cheeks flourish.
Rosie.
And narodil se Kristus Pán, veselme se, Růže květ nám, radujme se, života čistého, z rodu královského, narodil se.
And those would be sung at church, or would they be sung at home?
We would sing this at home, but the first time I remember was in Castle Nemischel, the Christmas we spent there, and I would sing it with my mother, who lived until age 99.
I wanted to ask you, and we've had this conversation before, so I'm always very specific about my questions. I wanted to ask you about whether your family, your parents, did they return to Czechoslovakia? Did you return to Czechoslovakia?
Yes. Well, my parents, there was a sort of a difference. A mother promised never to return after the communists took over, and she never returned. She could have returned because she lived after the curtain in Berlin was destroyed and Czechoslovakia became free, but she did not want. Father and my brother returned. Father in the 80s, brother and his family in 86, and they appreciated being able to view Nemischl, which had been taken over by the government. Later, we found out that it was supposed to be an orphanage, but actually, the so-called orphans were the sons and daughters of political dissidents imprisoned by the communists. I returned after communism was overthrown. Czechoslovakia was free. Yes. But I understood mother. She wanted to live from her memories, just to remember her memories the way they were. Yeah.
What happened to the family property in Czechoslovakia? Was it taken,
Well,
seized by the Nazis?
my cousin Ivan Dane, who moved to Argentina after the war, filed a claim against the Czech government. It took him almost 9 years. And among other things, he had to prove that the people that lived in Nemetschel, his father and his grandmother, no one had ever collaborated with the Nazis. And of course, I knew they did not. In fact, my uncle had participated in the Czech resistance, but it had to be proved. How? Well, by asking the people in the village, the neighbors, and they vouched for it. Yeah. So it was returned, but such a property is very expensive to maintain. Ivan was living in Argentina. He had two sons, but the sons were totally Argentinian. They had land in Argentina. So in 2012, he decided to sell it. And the end of the story is in a way sad, because guess who bought it? A Russian oligarch. So it's gone. It's gone. Now the Tetzelis, my father's family, they survived. They weathered the storm, both Nazism and communism. They are doing very well. And they were compensated for the house that the communists destroyed to build a police station. They were compensated. They were compensated for the shares later, for the shares of stock they owned in the brewery, when the brewery disappeared. Yeah. Czechoslovakia has the highest consumption of beer in the world. So when I returned in 2008 and I met my cousin who was in charge of all these affairs, she gave me a big stack of Czech crowns. And there was no exchange problem. So I returned home with like $18,000, which, I inherited from the Tetzelis. There are numerous Tetzelis. I mean, she had to split it in like 30 or 40 parts. She did her job.
We're getting closer to our goodbyes. I'm going to show a last photograph, and I would like you to tell us about leaving Cuba, where you were you were working, you had already married, and
Yes.
moving to Miami. And here is the last photo I want to share with our audience. It's right here.
Okay. That's the family in Miami. John Paul from left to right, my wife, Elena, Cuban, born in Madrid, myself, my son, Andrew, who is our technological guru. He lives with us. He was born in Atlanta, Georgia. Our daughter, Monica, who was born in Atlanta, Georgia. And last but not least, Elena Maria, our firstborn in Havana, who is an attorney, immigration attorney here in Miami. And we left Cuba in 1961. I was then employed by the Ministry of Foreign Trade. Cuba had by then become communist. The Bay of Pigs innovation had failed. We knew about the change that Castro had when he decided to embrace communism in 1960. We realized that, and accordingly, we tried to help the counter revolution. And Elena had an adventure when she participated in rescuing one of the invaders who had managed to arrive to Havana and taking him to a European uh, embassy. And uh, mother helped us because we gave our house was a safe house with a CIA operative in Havana. And when the invasion failed, of course, we had to find a way for him to get out of Cuba. And mother was a friend of the papal nuncius. She knew everybody in Havana. She told her of our problem, and he gave her the solution. And our friend was able to obtain political asylum, which was respected even by the communists in Cuba, and leave the country. So we got to the US in May, Elena in June, myself, 61. I found a job in New York with a major bank on number 1 Wall Street. Uh, the job was very simple. I translated letters from Spanish to English and from English to Spanish, since I knew both languages. But shortly thereafter, we moved to Atlanta because we wanted a place that was not as hectic as New York and better for our 2 kids to be raised. And in Atlanta, I found a job as a trainee in the Citizens and Southern Bank, and uh, we prospered in Cuba in that we had 2 more kids, and we stayed there about 10 years, and then uh, got an offer for uh, a better job, and I spent about 30 years in the US in the same profession in international banking as an officer, eventually in charge of Latin American business. And then later when we had been in Miami for some years, I got into the insurance and annuities business, and I still have an agency, but I'm practically retired. The only thing I do is servicing my customers. And Elena had a very successful career as a commercial banker, as a broker uh, in the stock market. She rose to vice president with the biggest bank in the U.S., the Bank of America, and she retired in 2004. And we have been traveling a whole lot in Europe and in Argentina, all over the place since then. So we greatly appreciated what uh, Inês, you have been doing, and the municipality of Cascais, you have our gratitude. And in closing, to my children and in-laws, Elena Maria and Eric, John Paul and Marta, Monica and Andrew, and nephews and their in-laws, Rick and Mary, Bill, Chris and Emily. This Exodus story is part of where you came from, the values of freedom, tolerance, and patriotism of your paternal grandparents. They sacrificed and acted on these values. We all owe to them the life we are living in America and our recognition and gratitude. To Portugal, you gave us shelter to my parents, my brother, and I in our time of need and enable us to escape the Nazi onslaught. Our heartfelt thanks for your open arms and for your noble quest to preserve the memories of the exiles you help for future generations. Thank you. Thank you, Maria Inés.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you for your words. And it's of course, I've told you this many times, it's the high point of the work we do at the Exiles Memorial Center, speaking to you, speaking to people who went through the same experience as you did as a child, finding out about the fabulous lives you've built for yourselves. And we do hope that even in these strange times,
Yeah.
hold on to these stories and find in these life stories the courage and the hope that
Yeah.
is necessary. We do have one question from someone I think you may know, Audrey Geyer. And
Audrey, Audrey, granddaughter.
I am John's oldest granddaughter. For those watching who don't get the pleasure of talking to him more often, and for the educators watching who are teaching the next generation, what is the most important thing that young people should learn from your experience as a refugee?
I think in order to be able to react the challenges that inevitably everybody faces, you have to build strong values and be ready to act on them. Values are not something that is written in a book of philosophy. It's something that becomes part of you as a conditioned reflex. It's something totally intangible, but especially in this country with the founding fathers that had that great declaration, that all men are created equal, endowed with the Creator, etc. And the examples that they set and that have cost so many sacrifices. This is an extremely noble, giving, open society. And this is what we must make ours, in the sense that we must be ready to act and put these values in action, which is what our parents did, your great-grandparents in Central Europe. So, Audrey, that was a terrific question.
It was a very, very good question. And I can use Audrey's question to say that one of our efforts at the Memorial Center, museums such as ours always struggle between strictly honoring the memory and the past and educating for the present and the future. And so we've developed, in addition to the exhibition and the programming, we also have our history labs. And what we do there is we meet schools, and we meet schools where they want. We meet them online. We go to the schools can come to us. We can go to an open air space. We meet Portuguese schools, international schools, schools abroad. And we share with them the stories that you and others have shared with us. And we use those stories to develop democracy skills, to develop critical thinking skills, where
those are practical lessons, yes.
And where the youth understands that the democratic system is part of their own DNA, and that it is their duty to uphold it. It's not just they are not born into it, and they are always one election away of losing it. And
right.
I think anyone that works in this area understands the power of the wasted vote when looking at Nazi Germany and looking at how.
Oh yes. No, it's a pattern that unfortunately we have seen developing here. No, we must be alert.
I wanted to leave people with hope. I wanted to leave
Yes.
people who are here. I wanted to leave them with the idea that everywhere around the world there are big museums and there are small museums like ours who are doing not just the programming but the education. We do have a newsletter that we send out. It's a bilingual newsletter. And if you want to receive it, do email us at this email number account that is here. You can find us online, but all our communications platforms are in Portuguese, so it might be difficult for those of you who aren't native speakers. But do email us at this account and we will get back to you. This, John, of course, has been fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. For those that are based in the Cascais municipality, in November, we will go on history walks and we will find out about the Sousa Mendes visa recipients who stayed in Monte Estoril. So join us for that. Everything is done with COVID safe measures. John, have a great evening. To everybody who was here with us, I wish a great evening and a great afternoon for you, filled with reflection about the themes and what we talked about in this last hour and a half. And thank you, Elena, as well, for being there. And
Hello.
and congratulations on the life you've built. That difficult mid.
No,
No, yes.
thank you, Maria Inês Brandão. Were it not for you, I wouldn't be here. So thank you. Keep it up. Keep it up.
Very much. And everybody have a great evening. Goodbye.
The same to you.
You do too. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.